New York in the early 20th century was a city built on ambition and shadow. Above ground, the skyline reached ever higher, steel bones climbing into the clouds, lit by the neon confidence of a country sprinting toward modernity. But beneath that energy, beneath the roar of elevated trains and the clang of shipyards, another city existed. It lived in smoky back rooms where political favors were traded like currency, in union halls where muscle outweighed bylaws, in nightclubs that pulsed after midnight with a mix of glamour and danger. It was a world where influence didn't need to be spoken to be understood, a world shaped by silent power. And at its center emerged a man who saw opportunity where others saw chaos, Charles Lucky Luciano. To the casual observer, Luciano was just another gangster, sharp suit, sharper eyes, and a reputation built in the rougher corners of Manhattan's immigrant neighborhoods. But this was not a man content with street-level schemes or territorial scraps. He approached the underworld the way a rising executive studies a fractured industry, by identifying inefficiencies, eliminating outdated models, and creating systems that could outlast any single personality. While his rivals fought over blocks and grudges, Luciano saw a bigger map. Where they saw rackets, he saw markets. Where they saw gangs, he saw departments. And where they operated in the moment, he was thinking in terms of strategy, structure, and succession. In an era when organized crime in America was anything but organized, Luciano recognized a truth no one else had articulated. Scattered crews, each answering to a volatile boss, could never build enduring power. The old world style of leadership, based on family loyalty, territorial pride, and tradition, was a liability. What the American underworld needed wasn't another Don. It needed a CEO. This realization was born from both environment and instinct. New York in the 1920s and 30s was swelling with immigrants, vice markets, and economic desperation. Prohibition had turned liquor into gold, enforcement was inconsistent, and politicians were eager to be bought. Criminal opportunity was everywhere, but so was conflict. Gangs waged street wars that burned money and bodies with equal recklessness. Alliances shifted like sand. No one controlled the entire picture. Luciano, watching from the inside, understood that the problem wasn't lack of ambition, it was lack of structure. A business without clear hierarchy, division of labor, and predictable rules was doomed to self-destruct. He began to imagine a different model, one borrowed from the corporate giants reshaping America at the time. Standard Oil had centralized the oil market. U.S. Steel had consolidated production. Why couldn't crime do the same? His thinking redefined not just the operations of the mafia, but its philosophy. First, he championed diversification. Gambling, narcotics, prostitution, loan sharking, labor racketeering, each treated as a specialized division with its own managers and revenue targets. Second, he understood the power of cooperation. Instead of endless turf wars, he envisioned a syndicate, a governing board where leaders from different ethnic and regional factions could negotiate, vote, and share profits. This was not just strategy, it was innovation. And perhaps most importantly, Luciano distributed power. The commission he helped create was a radical departure from the traditional pyramid with a single Don at the top. It functioned more like a board of directors, reducing the risk of coups, internal feuds, and impulsive decisions. It made the criminal empire scalable, resilient, and self-sustaining. With one stroke, he transformed the mafia from a collection of feuding families into a national organization with rules, processes, and accountability. Yet Luciano's corporate mindset went beyond structure. He understood branding, how fear, respect, and mystique could be wielded as assets. He valued networking, forming alliances with Jewish and Irish gangsters at a time when ethnic lines were rigid. He believed in reinvesting profits, in managing risk, and in maintaining a public image that mixed charm with calculation. In modern terms, he positioned himself as both visionary and operator, a leader who could articulate a long-term mission while still understanding the street-level details that fueled it. But this evolution raises a central question, one that frames the story that follows. How did one man turn influence into an industry? How did Luciano, a young immigrant from Sicily with little formal education, engineer the blueprint for America's most powerful criminal organization? What allowed him to think like a corporate strategist decades before the business world celebrated such thinking? And how did his innovations, born in dimly lit rooms far from boardrooms, reshape not only organized crime but the cultural imagination of power itself? This book begins in that tension between myth and method, chaos and calculation. It asks the reader to see Luciano not merely as a gangster rising through the underworld, but as an executive building an empire, one who understood markets, controlled competition, and scaled operations with ruthless efficiency. His story is not just about violence or vice, but about vision, the transformation of crime into a business model. In the pages ahead, we explore how Lucky Luciano became the architect of modern organized crime. But to understand the empire he built, we must first understand the world he saw, New York's hidden city of opportunity, risk, and reinvention. It was a world destined for a leader who could think differently. And Luciano did. He thought like a CEO. Before Lucky Luciano emerged as the architect of a new criminal order, the American underworld was a fractured, combustible world defined not by strategy but by survival. Early 20th century New York, with its swelling immigrant population and expanding vice markets, was a breeding ground for crime, but not organization. What existed before Luciano was not a syndicate, not a network, and certainly not a business. It was a patchwork of ethnic enclaves, volatile bosses, and rival gangs locked in perpetual, and often pointless, conflict. At the heart of this chaos was the legacy of the old world. The mafia families that arrived from Sicily brought with them traditions rooted in rural power struggles, fealty to a single patriarch, and a system where loyalty was owed to a man, not an organization. This model, built for isolated villages, was hopelessly mismatched with the sprawling, fast-moving, opportunity-rich terrain of New York City. Yet early mafia figures clung to it out of pride and cultural inertia. They operated like small competing kingdoms, each protecting territory the way a medieval lord guarded a hillside. In this landscape, bosses rose and fell quickly. Many ruled through fear alone, temperamental, unpredictable, often more concerned with personal slights than profits. An insult could spark a war. A rumor could trigger retaliation. These men were not business leaders or strategic thinkers. They were warlords. Their operations were guided less by intelligence and more by impulse. With no central authority, no conflict resolution mechanisms, and no shared rules beyond a vague idea of honor, the mafia's internal feuds drained resources and destabilized every profitable enterprise they touched. Ethnic turf battles fueled the disorder further. Italian factions clashed with Irish gangs over waterfront rackets and labor unions. Jewish groups fought for control of gambling routes. Street corners that could have generated steady income instead became battlegrounds, where power was constantly challenged and rarely consolidated. Alliances were temporary, held together by fear or necessity rather than mutual benefit. Betrayal was not an exception, it was an expectation. The Morello crime family, one of the earliest Sicilian groups to gain prominence in New York, exemplified both ambition and dysfunction. Their operations in counterfeiting and extortion were lucrative, but their leadership was rigid and paranoid. When rivals emerged, especially the Neapolitan and Calabrian factions who resented Sicilian dominance, violence eclipsed opportunity. The murder of members on both sides created instability that rippled through the city's underworld. No single group could capitalize on New York's booming vice markets because they were too busy trying to annihilate each other. The infamous Mafia Camorra War of the mid-1910s revealed just how destructive this chaos could be. Instead of dividing the city into manageable territories or cooperating for mutual profit, the Sicilian Morellos and the Neapolitan Camorra fought a reckless feud that yielded little except bloodshed and attention from police. Informants multiplied as frightened lower-level members scrambled to save themselves. By the war's end, arrests and executions had shattered both factions' ability to lead effectively. This was not organized crime, it was disorganized carnage. Even within individual families, the absence of structure was glaring. Bosses operated without clear hierarchies. Capos controlled small crews with near-total autonomy, often hoarding profits or defying their own leaders. Murders were commissioned without approval. Deals were made without consultation. There was no system for expansion, no process for decision-making, no financial oversight. In today's terms, these groups function like startups with no business plan, no management strategy, and no conflict resolution protocol, except the gun. The onset of Prohibition in 1920 should have been a unifying moment. Overnight, alcohol became a black market commodity worth millions. But instead of cooperation, the crime world fractured further. Dozens of gangs scrambled for control, hijacking each other's shipments, bribing the same officials, and fighting over distribution routes that could have supported multiple groups if they had coordinated. The potential for corporate-level profit was enormous, but the mafia's old structures could not support such opportunity. The bosses were too territorial, too suspicious, too wedded to tradition to adapt. The instability had predictable consequences. Police crackdowns increased as violence spilled into the streets. Businesses became wary of dealing with any faction. Politicians grew frustrated with the constant disruption. The underworld's reputation was one of incompetence and excess, a storm of disorder rather than a functioning enterprise. It was in this environment of dysfunction that Luciano's vision began to take shape. He saw what others were blind to, that the mafia was failing not because its members lacked courage or ambition, but because the system itself was flawed. The old-world model had no scalability, no efficiency, and no capacity for sustained growth. The ceaseless feuds consumed talent and capital. The lack of rules made leadership fragile. And the obsession with ethnicity limited opportunities for expansion. Chaos for most was a barrier. For Luciano, it was a blueprint waiting to be redrawn. He understood that if crime was going to evolve, if it was going to thrive in a modern city powered by money and competition, it needed a different framework entirely. It needed cooperation instead of rivalry, structure instead of improvisation, and leaders who could think beyond the block, beyond the borough, beyond the old codes. The disorder of the pre-Luciano era was more than backdrop. It was the crucible that shaped his revolutionary thinking. And when the moment came, he would not simply survive that chaos. He would use it to seize control of an underworld desperate for order. Before he became the architect of organized crime, Lucky Luciano was simply Salvatore Lucania, a boy from Lercora, Sicily, thrust into a world that tested him long before he ever learned to fight back. His earliest memories were shaped by poverty, by the harshness of Sicilian life at the turn of the century, and by a culture where power was spoken in glances more than words. When his family boarded a ship for America in 1906, they were chasing the same dream as thousands of other immigrants. A chance at stability, a chance at dignity, a chance at something better than struggle. What they found instead was New York's Lower East Side, a place that devoured the weak and hardened the rest. For young Salvatore, Manhattan was overwhelming. Tenements stacked like cages, streets thick with noise, smoke, and desperation, vendors shouting, drunks stumbling, and children swarming for any coin that hit the pavement. The Lower East Side was not a neighborhood, it was a proving ground. Italians, Jews, Irish, Poles, everyone was poor, everyone was hustling, and everyone was trying to climb out of the pit. This was where Luciano learned the first rule of survival. No one gives you anything. You take what you can, you protect what's yours, and you keep your eyes open. School offered him little. English came slowly, frustration quickly. What fascinated him wasn't books, it was people. Even as a child, Luciano had an uncanny ability to read others, to sense who could be pushed, who demanded respect, and who hid fear behind bravado. He knew when to charm and when to intimidate, when to offer help and when to demand payment. These instincts weren't taught, they were survival tools honed on streets where a wrong judgment could cost you more than pocket change. By his early teens, Luciano drifted into the world of street gangs, not out of rebellion but out of necessity. The 5 Points Gang, one of the most notorious in New York, became his training ground. There, under older, hardened criminals, he learned the rhythms of the underworld, how protection rackets worked, how gambling dens operated, how money flowed through the city's veins. But unlike many boys who joined gangs for status or thrill, Luciano studied the systems behind the chaos. He watched how fear could be leveraged, how alliances shifted, how power was never static. The streets weren't just dangerous, they were instructive. It was during these years that Luciano formed the relationships that would alter the trajectory of organized crime in America. One of the most defining friendships of his life began not with violence, but with a coin toss, or rather, the absence of one. Luciano, running a small-time gambling operation among neighborhood kids, noticed a skinny Jewish boy who refused to pay protection money. That boy was Meyer Lansky. Instead of beating him, Luciano assessed him. He saw in Lansky something unusual: intelligence, certainty, and unshakable calm even when surrounded by threats. When Lansky explained that he wasn't paying because he didn't believe in fear-based coercion, Luciano recognized a mind that thought in strategy rather than instinct. Respect, not dominance, formed the foundation of their friendship. "You're smart," Luciano reportedly told him. "We may do business someday." And they did, business that would shape the future of organized crime. Lansky complimented Luciano in ways few others could. Where Lucky brought charisma, street influence, and organizational instinct, Lansky offered mathematical precision, financial insight, and a cold, analytical mind. Their partnership, built in adolescence, foreshadowed the corporate-style approach Luciano would later apply on a national scale. But their relationship was more than practical. It was rooted in shared experiences as outsiders, immigrants navigating a world that treated them as lesser. Another figure soon entered their orbit: Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. If Lansky was the strategist, Siegel was the firebrand, the embodiment of volatility and ambition. Siegel had a fearlessness that bordered on reckless, a trait that made him both dangerous and invaluable. He and Luciano understood each other instantly. Bugsy's willingness to take risks paired well with Luciano's instinct for timing and opportunity. Together, the trio formed an unlikely yet powerful alliance. An Italian, a Jew, and another Jew whose brutality was matched only by his charm. In an era where ethnic boundaries defined criminal organization, their friendship alone was revolutionary. These relationships mattered, but what shaped Luciano most profoundly were the daily realities of the streets. Every day tested him: who to trust, when to strike, how to appear strong even when cornered. He learned that fear could be manufactured, that respect could be negotiated, and that loyalty was rarely unconditional. The world around him rewarded cunning, adaptability, and confidence. Violence was ever present, but Luciano understood early that brains outlasted bruises. The strongest man could win a fight, the smartest one could win an empire. By his late teens, he had risen through the ranks of the 5 Points gang not solely through muscle, but through intuition. He had an almost preternatural ability to anticipate people's moves, to sense hesitation, arrogance, desperation. His instincts for reading human nature became his greatest weapon. He understood that everyone wanted something: money, protection, validation, power. Identify the desire, control it, and you controlled the person. This psychological acuity would later become the foundation of his leadership style. Luciano didn't command through fear alone, as many early mafia bosses had. He commanded through understanding. He knew how to motivate, when to discipline, and when to reward. He knew how to make men feel valued even as he manipulated them. These insights were not learned in boardrooms or strategy sessions. They were forged in alleyways, in dimly lit bars, in frantic escapes from police sirens, in every moment when survival depended on reading the room faster than anyone else. By the time Prohibition dawned in 1920, transforming liquor into the most profitable commodity in American history, Luciano was no longer just another street kid. He was a strategist shaped by hardship, a leader molded by observation, and an entrepreneur with an instinctive grasp of human nature. The slums had given him something no formal education could: a deep, almost intuitive understanding of ambition, fear, and influence. These early years were not merely the prelude to his rise, they were the crucible. In the harsh streets of New York's immigrant quarters, Luciano learned the skills that would redefine organized crime. He formed alliances that would one day anchor a national syndicate. And he sharpened instincts that would guide him from survival to supremacy. Before he built an empire, he built himself. By the time the Prohibition era reached its fever pitch, Lucky Luciano had evolved from a street-hardened strategist into a visionary poised to reshape the very structure of American organized crime. While other bosses were chasing territory, whiskey routes, or short-term profits, Luciano was studying the system itself, its inefficiencies, its traditions, its vulnerabilities. He understood that crime, like any industry, could not thrive on chaos or personal vendettas. It needed structure. It needed predictability. It needed leadership that prized efficiency over ego. And most of all, it needed a blueprint. Delegation and division of labor. Luciano's first major innovation was deceptively simple: delegation. In an underworld dominated by domineering bosses who demanded absolute control, he recognized that no single man, no matter how feared or respected, could manage every racket, every dispute, every financial flow. The old model slowed operations and amplified internal conflict. So Luciano borrowed from the corporate playbook. He created a system where responsibilities were divided among trusted lieutenants, each overseeing specific operations: gambling, narcotics, prostitution, loan sharking, labor racketeering. These men weren't just enforcers, they were managers. They reported upward but operated with autonomy. The arrangement increased efficiency, reduced bottlenecks, and turned criminal activity into specialized departments that could scale far beyond what tradition allowed. This mindset transformed organized crime from neighborhood operations into a citywide, and eventually nationwide, enterprise. Profit sharing, a radical incentive where early mafia bosses hoarded profits and treated subordinates as expendable. Luciano understood human motivation far more clearly. If people felt invested, they would protect the system. If they felt cheated, they would sabotage it. Thus he implemented a profit-sharing model that redistributed earnings throughout the hierarchy. Capos, soldiers, and even associates received consistent percentages from the rackets they operated. This not only increased loyalty but minimized infighting. Men no longer felt the need to steal, conceal, or rebel to gain their share. the system gave them a stake in success. Profit sharing also lowered the risk of betrayal. A man who earns regularly is far less likely to inform. Eliminating the boss of bosses, perhaps Luciano's most brilliant and audacious structural innovation was his dismantling of the capo di tutti capi, or boss of bosses. The title had long been a source of instability, its holder inevitably becoming a lightning rod for resentment and conflict. Power concentrated in one man created paranoia, revolts, and endless assassination plots. Luciano saw clearly that such a model was incompatible with long-term stability. It was an autocracy in a world that demanded equilibrium. To correct this, he orchestrated the removal of Salvatore Maranzano, the last self-declared boss of bosses. Maranzano's rigid, old-world leadership clashed with Luciano's vision. His obsession with hierarchy, his distrust of non-Sicilians, and his desire for absolute authority made him a liability. Luciano, with quiet precision and flawless timing, eliminated Maranzano not for revenge, but for organizational reform. In removing the position entirely, he prevented any one man, including himself, from becoming tyrant or target. This was not humility. It was strategy. Restructuring the 5 families with the old power structure cleared, Luciano reorganized New York's mafia landscape into a more stable and logical framework, the 5 families. Each family had a boss and underboss, a consigliere capos in charge of specific crew soldiers and associates beneath them. This hierarchy was firm yet flexible, consistent yet adaptive. It established clear chains of command and defined roles while allowing room for growth and strategic alliances. The families were no longer rival feudal states at war. They were branches of a larger enterprise. Laying the groundwork for the commission, the final piece of Luciano's blueprint, the concept that would cement his legacy, was the commission, the first governing body in American organized crime. It was designed to operate like a corporate board, with representatives from each major family resolving disputes, approving major decisions, and managing national operations. The commission emphasized shared power instead of singular rule, voting instead of violence, negotiation instead of vendetta, national coordination instead of local rivalry. It was revolutionary. By institutionalizing order, Luciano reduced the frequency of gang wars, stabilized revenue streams, and integrated multiple ethnic groups into the criminal economy. Italians, Jews, and Irish mobsters all operated within a structure that recognized their territories and contributions. The commission wasn't just a governing body, it was a safeguard against the very chaos that had plagued the underworld for decades. Quiet leadership, calculated power. Luciano's leadership was defined not by loud declarations or flashy dominance, but by quiet calculation. He understood that in the underworld ego was poison. Leaders who demanded constant displays of loyalty eventually provoked rebellion. Bosses who ruled through fear alone wore out their usefulness quickly. Instead, Luciano governed through listening before acting, mediating before punishing, rewarding before demanding. He valued competence over bloodline, results over rhetoric. Even his closest associates noted that he rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. His authority rested on his clarity of vision, his fairness in resolving disputes, and his ability to maintain stability in an industry naturally prone to volatility. That didn't mean he shied from violence. He used it surgically, never theatrically, when necessary, not impulsively. This discipline made him both respected and feared. Men followed him not because he terrified them, but because he made them money, offered them structure, and gave them a future. The foundation of an empire. Luciano's reforms did more than change the mafia, they professionalized it. What he built was not a gang but a network, not a kingdom but a corporation. His innovations created resilience, allowed expansion, and ensured economic stability. Under his guidance, organized crime became exactly what its name suggested: organized. Luciano didn't simply inherit a criminal system. He engineered one. And in doing so, he laid the foundation for an empire that would outlive him, and influence every generation of organized crime that followed. Long before Lucky Luciano restructured the mafia into a modern criminal corporation, there existed a cultural force older than any organization, older even than the nation that would come to fear it. Omerta, the code of silence. Born in the hills and villages of Sicily, Omerta represented more than secrecy. It was identity. It was loyalty. It was protection. It was the unwritten law that governed men who lived outside the reach of legitimate authority. In America, however, under Luciano's leadership, Omerta evolved from a cultural tradition into one of the most powerful tools of organized crime. For Luciano, Omerta was not merely a romantic relic of the old world, it was a strategic asset. He understood its psychological weight, the way silence could be weaponized, the way loyalty could be commanded, and the way an oath could bind men more tightly than chains. In the world he envisioned, omerta wasn't optional. It was infrastructure. A system without trust collapses. A criminal empire without silence dies before it profits. Luciano ruled with the awareness that information was currency, and control of information was power. The psychological gravity of silence. Omerta's strength came from its simplicity. You did not speak. Not to police, not to outsiders, not even to other criminals without permission. It demanded absolute discretion, and that demand created a psychological bond deeper than fear. Silence became a test of character. To break it was to betray not just a man but an entire world. Luciano recognized that this psychological framing was invaluable. Men who internalized omerta felt honor-bound to protect the family. They policed themselves, inhibiting their own vulnerabilities. Silence, once adopted as a point of pride, made betrayal emotionally expensive. Even when threatened with prison, men often remained loyal not because they loved the leadership, but because breaking the code meant breaking themselves. Luciano reinforced this mindset constantly. He understood the culture he came from: poverty, pride, and the instinctive distrust of government. Omerta thrived in communities where people believed law enforcement didn't serve them, where silence was not only a moral stance but a defensive measure. Luciano deepened that mistrust strategically. If the state was the enemy, silence wasn't rebellion, it was survival. Omerta as a business necessity. From a business perspective, omerta was nothing short of revolutionary. It created predictability. When men stayed silent, operations remained protected, revenue streams remained stable, and law enforcement remained in the dark. For an enterprise spanning gambling, narcotics, labor racketeering, prostitution, and political corruption, the code of silence functioned like a corporate confidentiality agreement, enforced not by lawyers, but by the unwavering certainty of consequence. Luciano treated omerta as a cornerstone of his organizational blueprint. It supported delegation. Lieutenants could operate independently without fear of internal exposure. Profit sharing. With everyone protected by silence, money flowed consistently. The 5 families. Interfamily agreements only worked if no one leaked information. The commission. A governing body could not function if participants constantly feared exposure. In this sense, omerta was not simply a cultural rule, it was an operational requirement, the glue that held Luciano's modernized system together. Without it, the organization would revert to the chaos he had worked so methodically to eliminate. Enforcement. The quiet violence beneath the oath. But silence cannot exist without consequence. Luciano enforced omerta with quiet precision, never with reckless brutality. His violence was purposeful, reserved for moments when the stability of the system itself was at risk. When a man broke omerta, punishment was swift and unquestioned. There were no warnings, no second chances. To betray the code was to declare war on the entire structure. That clarity created its own form of discipline. Men understood the stakes. Silence was not simply requested, it was required. Luciano also rewarded loyalty, reinforcing the code from both ends. Those who endured prison without speaking were supported financially. Their families were cared for. Their sacrifice was honored. This dual approach, fear and reward, ensured the code was cemented not just in the mind but in the heart. A unifying force with a fractured edge. Omerta unified Luciano's empire. It dissolved ethnic boundaries within his organization. Italians, Jews, and Irish associates, each with their own histories and cultures, found common ground in the necessity of silence. The code forged alliances that had once been unthinkable. What mattered was not where a man came from, but whether he upheld the code. Yet omerta also contained within it a paradox, a vulnerability Luciano could never entirely eliminate. The code that united the empire could also shatter it if cracked. The moment one man chose protection over principle, the entire structure became exposed. Luciano knew that as law enforcement evolved, as prison sentences grew harsher, as temptations for betrayal increased, omerta would face pressures Sicily had never imagined. A single voice could bring down an entire family. Silence was powerful but fragile. And ultimately, it was this fragility that would haunt organized crime long after Luciano reshaped it. As the empire expanded, so too did the risks. Maintaining absolute silence in a world growing more complex became increasingly difficult. The code that had once been a shield could, under pressure, become a fault line. The binding force of an empire for Lucky Luciano, omerta was more than loyalty. It was architecture. It was an agreement that allowed men to trust the system even when they could not trust each other. It was the boundary line between order and collapse. The code defined his empire, empowered his reforms, and secured his legacy, yet it also contained the seeds of the future conflicts that would test everything he built. Silence was strength. Silence was control. But silence, once broken, could be ruin. Lucky Luciano's true genius did not lie solely in restructuring mafia leadership or eliminating archaic traditions. His brilliance came from understanding something few criminals of his era had ever grasped. Crime was an industry, and like any industry, it required systems, scalability, and predictable revenue streams. Where others saw rackets, isolated hustles, short-term opportunities, and turf-bound operations, Luciano saw markets. He saw potential for standardization, efficiency, and long-term profit. Crime, under his direction, ceased to be a chaotic assortment of street-level ventures. It became a machine. To understand the magnitude of Luciano's influence, one must examine the industries he industrialized, each transformed from improvised hustles into sophisticated operations that rivaled legitimate corporations in strategy and scale. Prostitution. A franchise syndicate before Luciano, prostitution rings were disorganized, local, and wildly unstable. Pimps operated independently, girls came and went, and profits fluctuated with police pressure. Luciano approached the business as if he were building a national franchise. He introduced standardized operations, managers overseeing specific brothels, recruitment pipelines to ensure a steady workforce, security teams to protect against rival gangs and police raids, revenue quotas, enforced weekly health checks to maintain reliability and reduce risk. Each brothel functioned like a branch of a larger company. Costs were controlled, payments were regularized, and profits were recorded with startling precision. Luciano removed volatility by professionalizing the infrastructure, ensuring that every location produced consistent income. He understood that predictability, not just volume, was the key to a profitable vice market. Gambling. Mathematics meets machismo to the old guard. Gambling was a matter of luck and muscle. Luciano, however, recognized that successful gambling operations were grounded in mathematics, not bravado. With Meyer Lansky, whose mind operated with the precision of an accountant and the cold logic of an engineer, Luciano transformed gambling into a rational, controllable enterprise. Together, they introduced centralized bookkeeping for all gambling dens, standardized odds to eliminate operator fraud, shared profit pools that funded expansion, mechanized counting systems to reduce theft, logical placement of operations based on market demand, not territorial ego. The pair essentially created a criminal stock market, tracking fluctuations in betting behavior, identifying peak hours, and adjusting operations accordingly. Gambling became not just a vice but a science. Lansky's later Vegas projects would evolve into legitimate casinos, but the foundation, the mathematical mindset, was born in Luciano's New York empire. Narcotics. Global pipelines with managerial oversight. Narcotics presented enormous risk, but Luciano saw undeniable potential. Where predecessors relied on scattered suppliers and inconsistent distribution, Luciano envisioned a global supply chain. He negotiated with international traffickers across Europe and Asia, funneling product through Sicilian contacts, French smuggling routes, Caribbean intermediaries, American dockworkers on his payroll at home. He built a distribution structure that mimicked legal logistics companies. Importers handled shipments, mid-level distributors coordinated bulk distribution, street-level crews managed retail sales, supervisors tracked flow and prevented shortages. Quality, quantity, and pricing were regulated, creating stability in a volatile market. Luciano understood that drugs attracted attention, but the profits were too significant to ignore. His innovation was not scaling narcotics, it was making narcotics manageable. Labor racketeering. The quiet power behind construction labor racketeering was perhaps Luciano's most subtle and profitable industry. Unlike prostitution or gambling, this racket operated in the shadows of legitimate industries. Luciano infiltrated unions with surgical precision, bribing union leaders to secure influence, installing his own men as stewards, controlling strikes, work slowdowns, and contract negotiations, extorting construction companies for labor peace and predictable timelines. This was not chaos. It was a market of influence. Contractors desperate to avoid delays paid willingly for protection. Developers relied on consistent labor conditions. Union bosses appreciated the stability Luciano offered, even if it came at a price. Labor racketeering provided something no other racket offered: recurring, recession-proof revenue. As long as buildings were being constructed, Luciano profited. Protection markets. Recurring revenue at scale protection rackets existed long before Luciano, but he industrialized them. Instead of random shakedowns and unpredictable intimidation, he created subscription-based extortion. Businesses paid weekly or monthly dues in exchange for security mediation insurance against vandalism exemption from harassment by other gangs. The brilliance was that protection became predictable. It resembled a service fee, not a threat. This made merchants far more willing to pay, and far less likely to call police. In many neighborhoods, Luciano's protection crews acted as the de facto government, delivering safety with ruthless efficiency. Recurring revenue allowed Luciano to fund expansion, bribe politicians, and support imprisoned associates, ensuring the loyalty that omerta demanded. The machinery behind the empire. In each industry, Luciano imposed the same principles. Division of labor management, oversight, financial transparency within the hierarchy, predictable quotas and revenue streams, cross-family cooperation through the commission. He treated the underworld like a corporation with diversified income sectors, each evaluated for efficiency and risk. His lieutenants became department heads. His capos became regional managers. His associates became operational staff in a sprawling shadow economy. Crime, under Luciano, ran on systems, not impulses. Each racket contributed not only money but stability. Luciano understood that power was not measured by ruthlessness alone, but by the ability to produce consistent results. His empire was built not on fear but on structure. And that structure, quiet, scalable, and relentlessly efficient, was the backbone of his hidden influence. Every empire is shaped not only by the man who leads it, but by the figures who surround him. Some willingly, some reluctantly, some disastrously. Lucky Luciano's ascent was not a solitary climb. It was a strategic dance across a battlefield crowded with ambition, ego, and blood. He rose by supporting some, outmaneuvering others, and removing the few who refused to adapt. But what set Luciano apart was not ruthlessness. Many gangsters possessed that. It was his understanding that power was not dominance, but leverage, and that influence required foresight, not fury. Few navigated the volatile landscape of the American underworld with the precision Luciano displayed. His four most consequential counterparts, Joe Masuria, Salvatore Maranzano, Dutch Schultz, and Vito Genovese, each represented a different test of his strategic brilliance. Joe Masuria, the anchor of the old world before Luciano carved a new order from the chaos, he had to contend with Joe, the boss Masuria, a relic of the old world mafia. Masuria ran his organization like a feudal lord, clinging to Sicilian traditions that no longer fit the economic reality of Prohibition-era New York. He demanded tribute, obedience, and unquestioning loyalty. To him, Luciano was valuable muscle, nothing more. But Luciano saw Masuria's limitations. The old Don understood violence but not business, fear but not strategy. His refusal to embrace multi-ethnic alliances or profit-sharing created stagnation. Under Masuria, the mafia remained fragmented, ethnic lines rigid, rackets poorly managed, and wars inevitable. Luciano joined Masuria's camp not out of loyalty, but as a strategic apprenticeship. He studied the boss's methods, learned his weaknesses, and built his own alliances quietly under the surface. Masuria's oppressive leadership provided Luciano with the contrast he needed, an example of what not to be. When the Castellammarese War erupted, Luciano recognized that the conflict was wasteful, a feud driven by ego and old grievances rather than economic necessity. He made his move not through rebellion but through opportunity. Masuria became the first major obstacle Luciano removed, not out of hatred, but because the old world anchor threatened the modern empire Luciano envisioned. Salvatore Maranzano, the visionary rival. If Masuria represented stagnation, Salvatore Maranzano represented dangerous ambition. A fellow Sicilian with a more modern approach, Maranzano admired Caesar and believed himself destined to be the American mafia's undisputed ruler. He sought to impose order, structure, and discipline, but all under his absolute control. At first, Maranzano saw potential in Luciano, even promoting him within his hierarchy. But Luciano quickly recognized the flaw in Maranzano's vision. It replaced one tyrant with another. Maranzano's desire to become boss of bosses was not modernization, it was autocracy disguised as reform. While Maranzano admired Caesar, Luciano admired corporations. Where Maranzano sought empire through hierarchy, Luciano sought stability through shared power. Their visions collided inevitably. Luciano played the long game. He cooperated publicly, built alliances privately, and waited for the moment Maranzano overplayed his hand. When the Don began plotting Luciano's assassination, Luciano acted decisively. The removal of Maranzano cleared the path for the commission, a structure immune to the tyranny that had doomed his predecessors. Maranzano was not an opponent Luciano hated. He was one he outgrew. Dutch Schultz, the wild card if Masuria was stubborn tradition and Maranzano dangerous ambition, Dutch Schultz was unpredictable volatility. Violent, impulsive, and erratic, Schultz built a vast bootlegging empire but lacked discipline. He viewed the underworld as a battlefield where victory came through intimidation and body counts. Luciano saw Schultz differently, as a liability. The turning point came when Schultz declared his intention to assassinate prosecutor Thomas Dewey. Luciano knew such a move would trigger a government crackdown that threatened not just Schultz's operations, but the entire national underworld. Schultz saw enemies, Luciano saw consequences. This moment revealed Luciano's deepest strategic instinct. Sometimes power means stopping someone else's ego before it destroys everything. When Schultz refused to abandon his suicidal plan, Luciano sought the commission's approval and removed him, not out of rivalry but out of necessity. The death of Dutch Schultz was an act of organizational self-preservation. It signaled Luciano's commitment not to personal gain, but to the stability of the system he'd built. Vito Genovese, the ally who coveted power among all Luciano's allies, Vito Genovese was the most dangerous. Brilliant, brutal, and relentlessly ambitious, Genovese shared Luciano's hunger for influence, but lacked Luciano's restraint. Where Luciano preferred diplomacy, Genovese preferred intimidation. Where Luciano valued patience, Genovese sought immediate domination. Yet for years they worked side by side. Luciano recognized Genovese's talent and used it strategically, assigning him high-stakes operations, leveraging his ruthlessness when subtlety failed, and trusting him with responsibilities other men could not handle. But Luciano also understood something essential. Genovese wanted the throne. Their relationship was one of constant calculation. Luciano treated Genovese as both ally and potential usurper, supporting him enough to keep him useful but never close enough to threaten the core of the organization. It was a chess match played in silence, each man waiting for the other to make a revealing move. Ultimately, Genovese's ambition would shape his later betrayal. Yet even this outcome affirmed Luciano's brilliance. He had positioned the organization to survive leadership shifts, rendering personal ambition less destructive than in the old days. The chess master of influence. What made Luciano extraordinary was his ability to see people not as obstacles, but as pieces, each with unique movements, strengths, and vulnerabilities. He didn't seek dominance for its own sake, he sought leverage. He anticipated reactions, managed emotions, and aligned motivations like a master strategist. With Masuria he learned what had to be dismantled. With Maranzano he learned what could be improved. With Schultz he learned what must be prevented. With Genovese he learned what could not be trusted. Through these alliances, rivalries, and calculated assassinations, Luciano mastered the art of influence, reshaping the underworld not through force alone, but through foresight and the relentless pursuit of stability. He did not play to win battles. He played to win the board. For all its structure, strategy, and business-like sophistication, Lucky Luciano's empire existed atop a constant fault line. Beneath the polished machinery of prostitution syndicates, gambling networks, narcotics pipelines, and labor racketeering, a hidden war simmered, one that never appeared in newspapers or police reports, yet dictated every decision he made. Luciano's power was not built in a vacuum. It was surrounded by enemies, infiltrated by police, and threatened by rival ambitions. The genius of his leadership was not simply the creation of order, but the ability to preserve it in a world designed to tear power apart. The pressure of surveillance. As Luciano's influence grew, so did the attention of law enforcement. The business-like efficiency of his empire attracted suspicion. A criminal organization that operated silently, avoided territorial wars, and produced stable revenue was more dangerous in the eyes of authorities than gangs that drew headlines with shootouts. Police units began wiretapping phones, shadowing his lieutenants, and planting informants. Federal agencies, frustrated by the mafia's invisibility, experimented with new investigative techniques. Undercover stings, financial tracing, political pressure campaigns. Even without concrete evidence, the government sensed the presence of a mastermind coordinating what had previously been scattered criminal activity. Luciano recognized that the real battlefield was not the streets, it was information. To counter surveillance, he fortified Omerta, limited communication channels, and required his capos to use intermediaries and coded language. Meetings were held in unpredictable locations. Sensitive operations were divided into compartments so that no single arrest could expose the entire system. Luciano didn't fight surveillance with violence. He fought it with invisibility. The rivalries beneath the surface. Even after eliminating Masuria and Maranzano and establishing the commission, Luciano's world was never free from internal tension. Cooperation was a veneer. Beneath it, the mafia was still an ecosystem of ambition. Family ambitions. Every family boss had his own vision of power. Some wanted more territory. Others resented sharing authority. Still others saw Luciano's influence, even without a boss of bosses title, as too expansive. To maintain balance, Luciano acted as a quiet mediator. He solved disputes before they escalated, reassured egos before they threatened alliances, and distributed opportunities across families to prevent resentment. His skill lay in recognizing that men fought more out of pride than profit. Remove the insult and you prevented the violence. Ethnic partnerships. Luciano's alliances with Jewish and Irish gangsters were radical and profitable, but they also created friction among traditionalists. Some capos feared dilution of Sicilian identity, others resented the influence of men like Meyer Lansky. Luciano extinguished these tensions through diplomacy, reminding his men that money had no ethnicity and success required cooperation. But the tension never fully disappeared. It simmered beneath every vote, every handshake, every deal. Internal betrayal. Ambition within his own circle was perhaps the greatest threat. Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, and other senior figures respected Luciano, but each harbored personal aspirations. Luciano knew loyalty was a spectrum, not an absolute. He stayed vigilant, redirected ambitions, and ensured that no single ally gained too much independent power. He didn't eliminate internal rivals unless necessary. He contained them. Police infiltration. The unseen invasion. Law enforcement, frustrated by the mafia's silence and fluid structure, began attacking the organization from within. Undercover agents attempted to infiltrate unions, gambling operations, and drug distribution networks. Informants, often facing prison time, looked for deals. Luciano responded with a blend of paranoia and innovation. He increased support for imprisoned associates to discourage cooperation. He standardized background checks for new recruits. He implemented rotating guards and diversified security personnel. He trained capos to identify behavioral shifts: fear, sudden secrecy, unexplained disappearances. Where previous mafia bosses reacted violently to infiltration, Luciano reacted systematically, treating it as a management problem rather than a personal insult. Diplomacy as a weapon. Luciano's ability to prevent wars through conversation was as lethal as any gun. He understood that a well-timed meeting, a strategic concession, or a carefully placed compliment could avert bloodshed. He used diplomacy to stop interfamily conflicts before they ignited, navigate disputes with allied ethnic groups, manage political relationships, discreetly convince hostile figures that cooperation benefited them. His diplomacy was rooted in psychological acuity, the same instincts forged in childhood. He knew that men wanted respect, acknowledgement, and profit. Give them two of the three and they rarely demanded the third. Diplomacy kept the empire running. Violence kept it from falling apart. Selective violence. Precision, not spectacle. Luciano viewed violence as a tool, not a language, not a signature, not a form of expression. It was deployed quietly and efficiently, targeted at threats to the system rather than expressions of emotion. He used violence for three purposes: to eliminate destabilizing figures, Dutch Schultz, whose recklessness endangered the entire criminal economy; to enforce omerta, silence had to be absolute or the machine collapsed; to prevent coups. When internal ambitions crossed dangerous lines, Luciano removed the threat before it matured. What made Luciano's violence terrifying was its predictability. Men understood the rules. They knew the consequences. Violence, under Luciano, was not chaos, it was policy. The unseen battles behind the business facade. From the outside, Luciano's empire resembled a seamless, efficient organization. But beneath that exterior, he fought a hidden war every day. Against surveillance, he used invisibility. Against rivalries, he used diplomacy. Against infiltration, he used structure. Against destabilizing enemies, he used selective violence. Against ambition, even his own allies, he used foresight and balance. Luciano never believed the world could be fully controlled. What he believed was more subtle: the world could be stabilized. His empire endured not because it was invincible, but because it was constantly defended by strategies most men never saw. The criminal economy ran smoothly only because Luciano fought relentlessly to keep its foundations from cracking. The hidden war never ended. Luciano simply became the best at winning battles no one else realized were happening. For years, Lucky Luciano had mastered the art of invisible power. He built a corporate-style criminal empire that ran with precision, minimized violence and avoided public spectacle. His structure was elegant, stable and disciplined, everything the anarchic mafia of old had never been. Yet it was this very sophistication, this seamless machinery, that would ultimately expose him. When influence becomes too organized, too efficient, too unmistakable, it ceases to blend into the shadows. It becomes a symbol. It becomes a target. By the mid-1930s, the winds around Luciano began to shift. What had once been a hidden economy operating beneath New York's glittering nightlife was now the subject of political ambition, press outrage and growing public alarm. To ambitious prosecutors searching for a face to pin to America's rising fear of organized crime, Luciano was perfect. Charismatic, methodical, and already whispered about as the mastermind no one could catch. His fall did not begin with a single betrayal or a single error. It began with a constellation of pressures, internal cracks, external scrutiny and shifting societal tides, that slowly turned influence into vulnerability. Cracks inside the machine. Even Luciano's meticulously designed structure was not immune to internal strain. As the criminal empire expanded, so did the number of men whose loyalty could be compromised. The system relied on silence, but silence depended on faith. Faith in leadership, in profit, in safety. All it took was one breach to trigger a cascade. Informants and weak links. In the mid-1930s, New York's vice squads intensified their efforts to dismantle prostitution rings. These operations, while profitable, also involved hundreds of workers, managers and intermediaries. The larger the system grew, the more people there were who could be pressured by police. Several mid-level operators were arrested on charges that carried crippling prison terms. Terrified and eager to save themselves, some broke omerta, not publicly but quietly in whispered agreements made in interrogation rooms. Their statements didn't initially name Luciano directly. Instead, they described an organizational hierarchy: managers, collectors, overseers. The very structure Luciano had built, the structure that made the syndicate so efficient, now gave prosecutors a map. What law enforcement could never decode from street-level chaos, they pieced together from the predictable design Luciano himself had imposed. Ambition inside the ranks. At the same time, internal rivalries deepened. Figures like Vito Genovese, long held in check by Luciano's careful diplomacy and firm leadership, began to see opportunity in the rising heat from law enforcement. Though not an open betrayal, Genovese did nothing to shield Luciano as investigations intensified. In a world where influence depended on perception, even quiet neutrality could be treacherous. Luciano was still the boss, but the foundations beneath him were shifting. Shifts in public sentiment. The 1930s brought a cultural transformation. The Great Depression had changed the American psyche. Corruption, vice, and criminal excess no longer seemed glamorous. Newspapers that once sensationalized gangsters now condemned them as parasites profiting from national suffering. Reform movements gained traction. Citizens demanded accountability and politicians responded. Vice crimes, particularly prostitution, became moral battlegrounds for ambitious public figures. To prosecutors, shutting down brothels was no longer the goal. Dismantling the system was. And the system had a name: Lucky Luciano. Public sentiment did not merely turn against the underworld, it demanded a champion. And into that role stepped Thomas Dewey. Thomas Dewey, the prosecutor who needed a symbol. Thomas E. Dewey was young, disciplined, and hungry for political ascent. He understood that New York needed a figure to rally behind, someone who represented integrity in a city struggling with corruption and organized vice. Dewey set his sights on the man portrayed, fairly or not, as the CEO of American crime. The irony was striking. Luciano's innovations had made crime less visible, less violent, and more efficient. But they also made him the perfect antagonist in a narrative of law versus lawlessness. Dewey recognized that the public did not want individual brothel keepers prosecuted. They wanted the system uprooted. Luciano, with his reputation for quiet control and strategic brilliance, became Dewey's ideal target. He represented the modernization of crime, the evolution from street thugs to boardroom-like executives of the underworld. Dewey needed a face. Luciano's influence provided one. The investigation titans using the informants from vice raids, Dewey constructed a sweeping theory. Luciano was the mastermind, the unseen director of a vast prostitution network. The evidence was indirect, often circumstantial, but it gained weight through volume. The testimonies, shaped by fear, pressure, and prosecutorial negotiation, painted a picture of an organization too coordinated to exist without central leadership. Luciano maintained he had no involvement in prostitution. In truth, he operated at such a high level that he rarely touched the day-to-day mechanics. But in Dewey's hands, this distance became an argument for orchestration rather than innocence. Dewey's team launched surveillance campaigns, interrogated more suspects, and pulled financial records from businesses linked to Luciano's associates. The pattern, however faint, was enough for Dewey to build a narrative. And narrative in a courtroom often mattered as much as proof. The arrest, influence recast as evidence in April 1936, Dewey struck. Luciano was arrested in a dramatic, highly publicized sweep, charged with compulsory prostitution. The spectacle was intentional. Dewey wanted a message sent. The days of untouchable mafia bosses were ending. For the first time in his career, Luciano faced a threat that could not be negotiated, bribed, or eliminated. His empire had shielded him from street-level violence, rival factions, and chaotic gang wars, but it could not shield him from a prosecutor who framed him as the criminal mastermind of a new era. The courtroom battle that followed was less about facts than about the symbolic power Dewey sought to harness. Luciano, the architect of order, was portrayed as the face of a hidden empire undermining the moral fabric of New York. Jurors, swept by the political and cultural climate, convicted him. The irony was devastating. Luciano's structure, once his triumph, had become the roadmap used to destroy him. His influence, once invisible, had turned against him. The trial of Lucky Luciano unfolded not merely as a criminal proceeding but as a national spectacle, a theater in which the state sought to expose, condemn, and ultimately destroy what it perceived as the most dangerous innovation in American crime. Thomas Dewey, the relentless prosecutor who had built his career on rooting out vice, understood that the courtroom was more than a place for legal arguments. It was a stage. And Luciano, long invisible to the public, was about to be dragged into the spotlight. The prosecution's strategy was simple, devastating, and brilliantly executed. Take the structure Luciano had built, the efficiency, the hierarchy, the organization, and reframe it as a machine of exploitation and corruption reaching across state lines. In the courtroom, his greatest achievement became the central evidence against him. The courtroom as a battleground. From the moment the trial opened in May 1936, Dewey made it clear that the case was not about a handful of brothels or local vice violations. It was about a criminal enterprise, one that operated like a corporation, expanded like a corporation, and in Dewey's words, infected the American economy like a corporation of corruption. The prosecution called dozens of witnesses, madams, prostitutes, pimps, bookkeepers, collectors, police informants, and even former mafia associates. Many came reluctantly. Some testified under pressure. Others spoke in hopes of leniency. But all contributed to Dewey's overarching narrative. The air in the courtroom was charged with tension. Journalists packed every bench, scribbling feverishly as each witness offered fragments of the story. Payments handed up the chain, protection fees distributed weekly, coded messages sent through intermediaries. On the surface, these details felt scattered. But Dewey's brilliance lay in arrangement. Piece by piece, he assembled the puzzle for the jury. Luciano sat almost immovable at the defense table, impeccably dressed, expression inscrutable. He understood what Dewey was doing, taking his invisible empire and giving it a face. His face. Vice workers become the corporate whistleblowers. The most compelling testimonies came from the vice workers themselves, women who had lived in the shadows of the very operations Luciano had industrialized. Their stories, though often inconsistent or shaped by prosecutorial coaxing, aligned in one crucial regard: the organizations they described had structure. Madams testified that they paid weekly dues to managers, who reported upward. Collectors confirmed that quotas were standardized. Some claimed they heard Luciano's name directly. Others spoke vaguely of a boss at the top, who controlled everything. To Dewey, it didn't matter whether the women personally knew Luciano. What mattered was demonstrating the existence of a unified system, something too sophisticated to exist without a central architect. Dewey framed the prostitution network as a corporation of exploitation, with Luciano as its CEO. Instead of describing random criminal acts, he described company policy. Instead of portraying individual brothels, he portrayed regional divisions. The prosecution's language was corporate, strategic, methodical, mirroring Luciano's own business model, but turning it against him. The jury listened as if being taught a new form of crime, one not driven by violence alone, but by organization. Informants and investigators mapped the empire. Next came the investigators who had tailed Luciano's associates for months, collecting records, tracking financial trails, and interviewing dozens of intermediaries. While the evidence was largely circumstantial, it painted a unified portrait. Too many brothels paying similar dues, operating under similar guidelines, and answering to similar figures for it to be coincidence. One detective described it succinctly: these weren't brothels. These were branches. Informants added fuel to the fire. Some were former members of Luciano's network. Others were criminals who traded testimony for immunity. Their accounts varied in detail but converged on one point: there was a chain of command and Luciano sat at the top. Even if Luciano had not personally touched the prostitution racket, Dewey argued, he supervised it the way a corporate chairman supervises subsidiaries. From above, unseen but unquestioned. Luciano's lawyers objected repeatedly, pointing out the lack of direct evidence, the contradictions in testimony, and the clear incentives witnesses had to cooperate. But the narrative Dewey crafted was too powerful. He wasn't prosecuting a man, he was prosecuting a system. Reframing strategy as corruption. The heart of Dewey's argument was not that Luciano committed individual acts of vice, but that he engineered the framework enabling thousands of such acts to flourish. Delegation. The prosecution called it outsourcing criminal responsibility. Profit sharing? An incentive system designed to expand corruption. Division of labor? A chain of command built for nationwide exploitation. The commission? An illegal board of directors for a national crime syndicate. What Luciano had seen as modernization, the prosecution reframed as industrialized criminality threatening the moral core of American society. Dewey wasn't just dismantling a criminal network, he was dismantling the very idea that such an enterprise could operate in America. The courtroom became a referendum on Luciano's vision. The defense fights a shadow. Luciano's attorneys struggled against the intangible nature of the accusations. No witness had seen him give orders. No document bore his signature. No police officer had caught him near a brothel. But the prosecution didn't need a smoking gun. They had built a narrative of corporate crime so compelling that jurors began to see Luciano not as a man, but as a myth brought to life. In the jury's mind, organization implied leadership. Leadership implied Luciano. The defense argued that Dewey's prosecution was politically motivated, that witnesses were coerced, that Luciano was being convicted for the actions of others. But the tide had turned. Public sentiment demanded a victory against organized vice. Dewey needed this win, and Luciano had become the symbol of everything the public feared. The sentence, a declaration of war on June 18, 1936, the verdict came, guilty on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. Judge Philip J. McCook delivered a sentence as theatrical as the trial itself, 30 to 50 years in prison, effectively a life sentence. The courtroom erupted. Dewey's reputation soared. Newspapers framed the moment as a triumph of democracy over corruption. And in many ways the sentence was more than punishment. It was a declaration. The state had not merely incarcerated a criminal. It had vowed to dismantle the very business model Luciano had created. The trial exposed his structure, his strategy, and his influence. But the sentence symbolized something greater, the beginning of America's war against organized crime as a corporate system. Luciano's fall marked not just the end of an era, but the state's recognition that the mafia he built was no longer a gang. It was an institution. And now that institution had its first casualty. Prison was supposed to be the end of Lucky Luciano. The courtroom had stripped him of mobility, authority, and anonymity, casting him into a fortress of concrete where influence traditionally went to die. Prosecutor Thomas Dewey believed he had severed the head of the criminal enterprise. Newspapers declared that Luciano's empire would crumble without its architect. But those predictions underestimated one essential truth. Luciano's power had never come from physical presence. It came from structure. It came from loyalty. It came from the system he had already built. When the prison gates closed behind him, Luciano did not rage or despair. He observed. He recalibrated. He adapted. Because he already understood what many never grasped. Real influence does not require movement, only reach. The commission keeps him alive. Luciano's legacy, the creation of the commission, became his lifeline. Designed to prevent internal wars, standardize operations, and distribute power among the five families, the commission now served a second purpose. It kept Luciano relevant even in captivity. He had engineered the mafia to function without a singular autocratic leader. Ironically, this decentralization meant the system continued running with remarkable efficiency even while its creator was confined. Each boss had responsibilities. Each family had territory. Each representative had a vote. No one, not even Luciano, controlled everything. Yet he controlled enough. Luciano still commanded respect as the architect of the modern underworld. Senior figures such as Frank Costello and Albert Anastasia visited him regularly under the guise of social calls or approved inmate interactions. These meetings were innocuous on the surface, friendly conversations, old acquaintances paying respects. But beneath the small talk, messages were exchanged. Updates from New York, tensions between families, financial distributions, and decisions requiring guidance. Luciano didn't issue orders. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he offered perspective. A word of caution here, a strategic reminder there, a subtle approval of a course of action already in motion. Influence, in this phase of his life, became suggestion rather than command. But suggestion, delivered from the mind that built the system, was enough. Intermediaries. The invisible hands. Luciano's loyal intermediaries operated as his shadow. Men like Costello, Anastasia, and various capos ensured that his voice, never recorded, never formalized, remained part of the mafia's bloodstream. They carried guidance from Dannemora prison back to New York streets with the precision of couriers in a corporate hierarchy. These intermediaries filtered problems. Disputes between families, conflicts over territory, concerns about enforcement and infiltration, financial questions about various rackets. Luciano offered clarity, patience, and the decisiveness that had always defined his leadership. And unlike his predecessors, whose imprisonment had often triggered coups or internal collapse, Luciano's absence did not destabilize the mafia. His structure protected him, ironically more effectively than any legal defense had. Inside prison walls, he became what corporate leaders today would call a remote executive. Psychological adjustment. A mind in captivity, not a spirit. The transition from master strategist to confined inmate could have broken lesser men. But Luciano approached imprisonment like any new environment, strategically. He analyzed the prison system the way he had analyzed the streets of Manhattan as a boy. He observed guards, routines, opportunities, restrictions. He adapted his internal rhythm, maintaining dignity and calm even in monotony. Fellow inmates described him as composed, almost serene, never outwardly bitter, never foolishly defiant. His mind remained active, constantly evaluating the future of the criminal world he'd shaped. He learned patience. He refined his understanding of people. He considered how each decision the commission made would ripple through the underworld. Prison did not shrink his world. It sharpened it. Luciano once remarked privately that freedom had many forms. Mobility was only one of them. Influence was another. The war changes everything. Then, in 1942, a global conflict unexpectedly extended a hand through the prison bars. World War II transformed New York's harbor into a vital artery for American military supplies. When the German submarine U-boat 123 sank the SS Norman off the Long Island coast, panic rippled through U.S. intelligence circles. Rumors spread that Nazi agents were active along the waterfront, sabotaging shipments and gathering intelligence. The government needed eyes and control on the docks, something no federal agency possessed. But Luciano did. Despite being incarcerated, Luciano still commanded loyalty among dockworkers, longshoremen, union leaders, and the criminal networks that operated along the waterfront. The underworld controlled the piers more tightly than the authorities ever had. And so, in a twist that blurred the lines between criminal and patriot, the U.S. government approached Luciano for help. The arrangement, later known as Operation Underworld, was as strange as it was symbolic. The man convicted of masterminding national corruption was now being enlisted to safeguard national security. Operation Underworld. Influence becomes asset. Luciano agreed to assist. Not because he felt patriotic, though he later claimed he did, but because influence is never wasted by those who understand its value. From his prison cell, Luciano facilitated communication between military intelligence and the dockside networks. He encouraged cooperation, stabilized tensions, and ensured that the threat of sabotage was minimized. Union leaders who might have resisted federal involvement suddenly complied. Dockworkers who might have ignored warnings became vigilant. The mafia, through its informal but powerful channels, helped secure the port. The irony was profound. The same structure that led prosecutors to call him the CEO of crime, now made him invaluable to the U.S. government. Operation Underworld did not free Luciano immediately, but it elevated his importance. It proved that even behind bars he remained a force shaping events beyond his cell. The mastermind without movement. Luciano's years in prison revealed a truth often forgotten in tales of criminal downfall. Influence survives confinement when it is built on structure rather than fear. Luciano's empire endured because he had designed it to. His leadership persisted because he had cultivated loyalty, distributed responsibility, and established a system meant to outlast any one man, including himself. He remained powerful, relevant, and strategic even with chains on his wrists. Mobility had been taken from him. But influence, quiet, calculated, and far-reaching, remained his greatest weapon. When Lucky Luciano boarded the ship that carried him into permanent exile in 1946, he was not the young strategist who once reshaped New York's underworld. He was a man in his late 40s, newly freed because of his wartime cooperation, yet stripped of citizenship, reputation, and home. America had been the canvas for his empire. Italy, the land of his birth, felt foreign. He had left Sicily as a boy with nothing. He returned as a man with everything taken away. Italy was not a place where influence could be easily rebuilt. The mafia there was a different organism. Older, more entrenched, more suspicious of outsiders, even those with blood ties. Luciano's American innovations, so transformative across the Atlantic, meant little to the Sicilian dons who viewed him as an Americanized intruder. Their world was bound by tradition, ritual, and a hierarchy immune to the corporate logic Luciano had perfected. He attempted to establish himself quietly, but surveillance from Italian authorities shadowed his every move. His reputation, amplified by American headlines, made him a magnet for suspicion. Police raided his residences, monitored his meetings, and restricted his travel. The state treated him as if he were still the invisible CEO of American crime, even as he struggled to influence anything beyond his own daily routine. Luciano was not used to irrelevance. But he recognized that Italy, rigid and insular, was not fertile ground for the leadership style he had once wielded so effectively. So he set his sights elsewhere, Havana. The Cuban interlude, a last attempt at relevance in 1947, Luciano arrived in Cuba, a place where the boundaries between legitimate business and organized crime were far more porous. Casinos glittered across Havana's shoreline, politicians were easily bought, and Meyer Lansky, his old friend and financial architect, had already begun shaping the island into a tropical extension of their American operations. For a brief moment, Luciano felt a spark of resurrection. Here, unlike in Italy, his presence mattered. Gangsters from New York flew to Havana to meet him. The commission acknowledged him. Lansky listened to him. Luciano felt something he had not felt since before his arrest: relevance. He attended strategy sessions, mediated disputes, and attempted to reassert quiet authority. But the underworld he returned to was no longer the one he had built. Younger, more aggressive figures now dominated the American scene. Vito Genovese, once his subordinate, was now maneuvering for supremacy back home. The new generation admired Luciano but did not need him. Meanwhile, U.S. pressure forced Cuba to expel him. American diplomats demanded his removal, warning that Havana had become a sanctuary for organized crime under his influence. Within months, Luciano was deported again, this time back to Italy with no hope of return. Havana had been his last real attempt to step back into the center of the criminal landscape. Its failure made something unmistakably clear: the empire still thrived, but its architect was no longer essential to its survival. A man outpaced by his own creation back in Italy, Luciano settled into a strange twilight existence. He lived in Naples, monitored constantly, visited occasionally by associates, but increasingly peripheral to the world he once dominated. The criminal landscape had evolved. The narcotics trade expanded globally in ways barely imaginable during his reign. The five families in New York operated with new priorities and new rivalries. The commission he had created still met, still regulated disputes, still provided structure, but without him. Luciano watched from afar as the blueprint he had designed matured into something beyond his control. His empire hadn't died. It had outgrown him. This realization, surprisingly, did not embitter him. If anything, it revealed the philosophical clarity that defined his later years. He had not built a kingdom dependent on his presence. He had built an institution. And institutions, by design, endure. Reflections of an old strategist in old age, Luciano spoke often with visitors, reflecting on his life with a mixture of nostalgia, humor, and quiet resignation. He did not lament prison or exile as much as the loss of purpose. The thrill of strategy, the endless calculations, the negotiations, the anticipation, had once animated him. Now he could only observe the world he shaped from a distance. He understood that influence fades naturally. Leadership is temporary. Structures endure. It was the same principle that guided his reforms decades earlier. Luciano also recognized a more personal truth. He had achieved everything he set out to do, but longevity was never part of the design. He built the modern mafia not to preserve his throne, but to create stability in an unstable world. That stability now existed without him. For a man who once believed influence required no mobility, Luciano finally discovered its limits. Distance, aging, and shifting landscapes had eroded his role. But the respect remained, rooted not in fear but in acknowledgement of the mind that shaped the underworld. The endgame. Luciano died in 1962, collapsing at the Naples airport after meeting with a film producer about a movie based on his life. Even in his final moments he was negotiating his own narrative, attempting to control how history would frame him. His death marked the end of a life defined by paradox. A criminal who became an executive. A leader without a kingdom. A strategist whose greatest creation flourished without him. Even as his influence faded, his legacy solidified. The Commission, the Five Families, the corporate structure of organized crime, these were the monuments he left behind. Luciano did not rule forever. He did not need to. The empire endured because its architecture was stronger than its architect. When Lucky Luciano died in 1962, the newspapers rushed to declare the end of an era. They were wrong. Luciano's era had not ended. It had simply become invisible, absorbed into the very structure of organized crime in America and beyond. His personal influence had faded long before his death, but the systems he built endured with the quiet inevitability of a well-designed machine. Luciano did not leave behind a gang, a faction, or even a family. He left behind a corporation, an organizational blueprint that would define the mafia for generations. To understand Luciano's legacy, one must see the mafia not as an evolving myth of violence and secrecy, but as an industrial model, one shaped by a visionary who saw opportunity where others saw chaos. His reforms, once radical, became foundational. His ideas outlived every ally, enemy, and successor. Luciano's presence dissolved, but his architecture remained. The Commission, a boardroom that never disbanded. Luciano's most influential innovation was unquestionably the Commission. Before him, the mafia operated like feudal kingdoms, territorial, volatile, and governed by personal vendettas. Wars erupted unpredictably, destabilizing rackets and draining resources. Luciano envisioned a structure that would prevent such waste, a governing body where leaders could negotiate, vote, and coordinate strategy. Even after Luciano's exile and death, the Commission continued to regulate. Disputes among the Five Families, expansion into new markets, distribution of territories, national-level decisions affecting multiple organizations. The Commission provided continuity. It prevented coups, managed succession, and reduced the frequency of inter-family wars. Future bosses, whether in New York, Chicago, or Las Vegas, operated within a framework that Luciano had engineered decades earlier. It was the mafia's board of directors, and its very existence proved Luciano's point. Systems outlast individuals. Profit sharing and the professionalization of crime. Profit sharing, Luciano's solution to internal rivalry, became a standard feature of organized crime. Under his model, every member had a stake in the success of the enterprise. Soldiers, capos, and lieutenants all received predictable shares. This incentive system transformed criminals into stakeholders and made rebellion economically irrational. Generations of mobsters adopted this approach because it worked. It lowered turnover, increased loyalty, and stabilized operations. Even organizations outside the Italian-American mafia, Jewish syndicates, Irish crews, and later Latin American and Eastern European criminal networks, adopted elements of this financial structure. Luciano had done what no Don before him had accomplished. He made crime predictable. National cooperation, the syndicate mentality. Before Luciano, gangs operated with fierce territorial pride and ethnic isolation. Luciano dismantled those barriers. He encouraged cooperation with Jewish and Irish groups, promoted interstate partnerships, and endorsed multi-city ventures. Crime in his mind was not local, it was national. It was scalable. His idea of a national crime syndicate, a cooperative network spanning states and ethnicities, became a reality that continued long after he disappeared from the scene. Gambling routes, narcotics pipelines, labor rackets, and loan sharking operations functioned across geographical boundaries because Luciano built the infrastructure that allowed them to. His successors inherited not just rackets but a network, A criminal marketplace integrated through shared interests rather than shared blood. Influence over visibility, the psychological blueprint. Perhaps Luciano's most enduring legacy was not a structure, but a philosophy. He understood people. He understood fear. He understood motivation. But more importantly, he understood something most criminals never grasped. Influence is more powerful than visibility. Luciano avoided public displays of dominance. He delegated authority, mediated disputes, and allowed others to shine while he orchestrated from behind the scenes. This psychological subtlety became the model for generations of mob bosses who followed him. Leaders like Frank Costello, Carlo Gambino, and even later Dons took lessons from Luciano's approach. Keep a low profile, let others speak publicly, make decisions quietly, build networks, not empires of personality. In this way, Luciano transformed not just the mafia structure, but its psychology. He replaced the swaggering Don with the calculating executive. He taught criminals to think like businessmen, not warlords. Global echoes. The Luciano template abroad. Luciano's innovations influenced criminal organizations far beyond America. Post-war Sicilian mafia factions adopted aspects of his model, particularly in profit distribution and inter-family cooperation. International narcotics networks mirrored his compartmentalized structures. Even modern cartels and syndicates today operate with divisions of labor, regional managers, financial oversight, and diversified revenue streams, traits Luciano embedded into the very idea of organized crime. His blueprint transcended geography because it was built on universal principles. Efficiency, predictability, loyalty through incentive, violence as policy, not spectacle, leadership through strategy, not ego. These concepts applied as effectively in Sicily, Mexico, and Russia as they had in Manhattan. A legacy beyond the man. Luciano's life ended quietly, far from the city he had once dominated. But the organization he built continued functioning with the same logic, the same order, the same underlying philosophy he had crafted decades earlier. His successors fought, schemed, profited, and expanded within a structure that still bore his fingerprints. The mafia did not remember Luciano because he ruled the longest. It remembered him because he built the longest-lasting system. His legacy is the paradox at the heart of his story, a man who lost power early but whose ideas achieved immortality. A strategist confined to exile, yet whose blueprint shaped criminal empires worldwide. A Don whose true reign began the moment he no longer needed to rule. Systems endure. And Lucky Luciano, more than any criminal in American history, understood that truth. In the story of Lucky Luciano, there is a temptation to focus on the outward symbols of power. The sharp suits, the smoky nightclubs, the whispered meetings in dim corners of Manhattan. It is easy to imagine him as the archetypal gangster, bold, feared, ruthless. But this myth obscures the deeper truth. Luciano's true legacy was not built in back rooms or alleys. It was carved quietly, methodically, and decisively in the realm of strategy. His influence lay not in spectacle but in structure. He didn't merely command men, he designed a system. He didn't merely run rackets, he engineered an empire. For all the violence associated with the mafia, Luciano understood that brutality alone could not create stability. Violence was a tool, not a foundation. Empires, whether legitimate or criminal, endure only when built on order, cooperation, and predictability. Luciano grasped this instinctively. While others swung between ego and chaos, he studied patterns. He identified inefficiencies. He saw opportunity where others saw tradition. In a world ruled by impulse, he thought like an architect. His rise from a Sicilian immigrant boy to the mastermind behind modern organized crime was not a story of luck, despite the nickname that clung to him. It was a story of observation and adaptation. Luciano possessed a rare ability to read people, their fears, their ambitions, their limits. He understood that a man who felt valued would work harder. A man who felt included would remain loyal. And a man who felt threatened would either comply or disappear. He turned human psychology into strategy, and strategy into governance. The mafia that existed before Luciano was a fragmented landscape of street brawls, ethnic turf wars, and volatile bosses ruled by emotion and tradition. Luciano replaced that scattered disorder with something unprecedented: a coordinated criminal economy. Through delegation, profit sharing, and the creation of the commission, he transformed crime from a series of territorial squabbles into a national syndicate capable of scaling, innovating, and cooperating. He eliminated the boss of bosses model not out of humility but out of foresight. Concentrated power created instability. Distributed power created longevity. This shift was revolutionary. It allowed the mafia not only to survive, but to thrive for decades after Luciano himself was imprisoned and exiled. His blueprint, clear, logical, and remarkably adaptable, became the DNA of organized crime well into the 21st century. Even as leadership changed, as wars erupted and families fractured, the underlying system endured. Luciano built the foundation so well that his empire outlived his relevance. And that is where his story becomes most paradoxical. Luciano spent the last portion of his life far from the city that once trembled at his name. Aging in exile, watched constantly by police, living without the mobility or authority he once wielded, he became a spectator to the world he had shaped. His attempts to reassert influence in Italy and Cuba were fleeting echoes of a past life. Rivals rose, alliances shifted, and the criminal landscape evolved beyond anything he could directly control. Yet the system, his system, remained intact. Luciano may have faded as a participant, but not as an architect. The five families continued to govern their territories. The commission continued to arbitrate disputes. The corporate logic he introduced, division of labor, shared profits, specialized departments, continued to define operations from narcotics trafficking to labor racketeering. Long after his death, criminal enterprises across the globe adopted strategies that echoed his innovations. His empire survived precisely because it no longer needed him. This was Luciano's most profound realization in old age, that influence, once embedded in structure, becomes self-sustaining. Power is temporary. Systems endure. He had created something that could function without a single charismatic figure at the helm, something greater than ego, greater than personality. A criminal world that once thrived on chaos now thrived on order, because he had willed it into being. But his legacy is not only organizational. It is psychological. Luciano demonstrated that the most powerful weapon in the underworld was not a gun, it was vision. The ability to see the long game. The ability to understand that violence without strategy was waste, and strategy without structure was fragile. He proved that influence could be wielded quietly, with diplomacy and foresight. He proved that leadership did not require visibility, only effectiveness. And he proved that an empire could be built not by clinging to tradition but by rewriting the rules entirely. Cinema often remembers Luciano as the suave gangster, the man who danced through the 1920s nightlife with charm and danger intertwined. History, however, remembers something far more significant. He was the architect of a new kind of underworld, one that learned, adapted, and organized itself like a corporation. His contributions reshaped the criminal landscape not just for a decade, but for generations. In the end, Luciano's legacy stands not on the crimes he committed but on the structure he engineered. His empire was not born from bloodshed alone, but from the strategic vision behind it. He took influence, once a fleeting, fragile thing, and transformed it into infrastructure. He made crime into a business and business into an empire. And so the story of Lucky Luciano closes not with the image of a tyrant, but with the silhouette of a strategist. A man who understood that real power is not held in the hand but woven into the system, not measured in years but in echoes, not cemented by force but by design. Crime became empire. Influence became legacy. And Lucky Luciano, long after his voice fell silent, remains the architect of that enduring truth.